The Texas sky was bleeding purple and gold over the horizon, the kind of sunset that makes a man stop whatever he is doing just to watch the day die with dignity. From the vantage point of the ranch porch, the world seemed perfectly ordered, silent, except for the rhythmic creaking of a rocking chair and the distant lowing of cattle settling in for the night. It was the sort of peace that George Strait had spent a lifetime singing about, a stillness that felt earned after decades on the road. But tonight, that peace was 1,000 miles away. Tonight, the silence of the ranch was just a memory, replaced by the electric hum of anticipation inside the NRG Stadium in Houston. The air inside the massive concrete bowl was thick enough to chew on, a heavy mixture of humidity, expensive perfume, stale beer, and the raw, unadulterated adoration of 60,000 souls. They called him the King of Country, a title he never asked for but wore with the same comfortable fit as his Wrangler jeans. He stood backstage, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, his black resistal hat pulled low over eyes that had seen every honky-tonk from San Antonio to Seattle. The roar of the crowd was already vibrating through the floorboards, a physical force that traveled up through the soles of his boots. It was a sound he knew better than his own heartbeat, a beast he had tamed night after night for 40 years. But tonight, the beast felt different. There was a static in the air, a nervous energy that pricked at the back of his neck, though he could not say why. Perhaps it was just the heat. Houston in late summer was a furnace, and even the industrial air conditioning of the stadium struggled to keep the sweat at bay. George walked up the ramp, his guitar slung over his shoulder like a shield. The moment he stepped into the spotlight, the darkness exploded. 60,000 people rose as one, a tidal wave of noise that washed over him. He smiled, that crooked, easy smile that had broken 1,000,000 hearts and mended 1,000,000 more, and stepped to the microphone. He didn't need pyrotechnics. He didn't need backup dancers or laser shows. He just needed 3 chords and the truth. As the band kicked into the opening riff of Amarillo by Morning, the stadium transformed. It ceased to be a sports arena and became a cathedral. Men with calloused hands wiped tears from their eyes, and women held their husbands a little tighter. For a few hours, the troubles of the world, the bills, the sickness, the endless noise of modern life, were suspended, held at bay by the baritone voice of a man who stood for something simpler, something real. The concert was going perfectly. The connection between the artist and the audience was a taut golden thread, vibrating with every note. It was the kind of night that legends are made of. But in the shadows of the VIP section, stage left, a different kind of story was being written. Brad was 22 years old, and he was bored. To him, George Strait was music for dinosaurs, a relic of a time before the internet, before relevance was measured in likes and shares. Brad was an influencer, a title he wore with arrogant pride, though his bank account didn't quite match his follower count. He had spent the last hour scrolling through his phone, ignoring the living legend on stage, desperately looking for an angle. He needed content. He needed something viral. His engagement numbers had been down for weeks, and in his world, irrelevance was a death sentence. He scanned the backstage area, his eyes darting like a predator seeking weakness. The security was tight, big men in yellow shirts blocking every access point, but Brad had a pass that allowed him to linger near the side barricades. That was when he saw him. An old man was shuffling through a service entrance that should have been locked. He looked completely out of place, a ghost from another era. He was wearing a heavy, dark trench coat, absurdly thick for the sweltering Texas heat. His face was hidden beneath a brimmed hat that had seen better decades, and he moved with a frantic, jerky urgency, his head down, avoiding eye contact. But it wasn't the coat that made Brad's heart skip a beat. It was what the old man was carrying. Clutched tightly in his right hand was a black hardshell case. It was long, narrow, and ominous. To a mind poisoned by 24-hour news cycles and action movies, it looked like one thing and one thing only: a rifle case, a weapon. Brad felt a surge of adrenaline that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with opportunity. This was it. This was the moment that would put him on the map. He didn't stop to think. He didn't stop to ask a security guard. He didn't consider that a man intent on mass violence rarely shuffles through a side door looking confused. Brad's thumb hovered over his screen, and with a swipe, he went live. The title he typed in with trembling fingers was designed to terrify. Urgent, gunman at George Strait concert. Security failed. He lifted the phone, zooming in on the old man in the trench coat. The camera shook, not from fear, but from a calculated decision to add drama. He whispered into the microphone, his voice breathless and frantic. "Guys, you are not going to believe this. I am at the NRG Stadium. Security is nowhere. There is a guy. Look at him. Look at him right there. He has a gun case. He is wearing a coat in 90-degree heat. He is walking right toward the stage. Oh my God, nobody is stopping him. We are sitting ducks here." The numbers on the top left of his screen began to tick upward. 10 viewers, 500, 2,000. The algorithm, a beast far more dangerous than any bull George Strait had ever ridden, caught the scent of panic and amplified it. The video was pushed to local feeds, then regional, then national. Within minutes, people sitting in the upper decks of the very stadium where Brad stood began to receive notifications. Down on the floor, Sarah Miller was holding her 6-year-old daughter Emily on her hip. They were swaying to the music, lost in the magic of the night. Emily was wearing a miniature cowboy hat, her eyes wide with wonder as she watched the man on stage. Then Sarah's phone buzzed in her back pocket. Then it buzzed again and again, a cascade of messages. She frowned, shifting Emily's weight, and pulled the device out. A text from her sister. "Are you safe? Get out of there." Sarah's brow furrowed. She opened the link her sister had sent. It was a live stream, a shaky video of a man in a trench coat, carrying a black case, walking through the shadows just 50 feet from where she stood. The caption screamed of an active shooter. Sarah's blood ran cold. The music seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a rushing sound in her ears. She looked around. She wasn't the only one. To her left, a group of college boys had stopped drinking their beers. They were huddled around a phone, their faces pale in the glow of the screen. To her right, a couple was arguing in hushed, frantic tones, the woman pulling at the man's arm, pointing toward the exit. The infection was spreading. It moved silently at first, a ripple in a pond. Heads bowed toward screens. The swaying stopped. The singing along died out, replaced by a low, terrified murmur that sounded like a hive of angry bees. The joy that had filled the arena just moments ago was evaporating, replaced by a cold, sharp scent of terror. It was a modern phenomenon, a panic induced not by a gunshot or a scream, but by pixels on a screen. The danger wasn't real, but the fear was absolute. On stage, George Strait was in the middle of the second verse. He closed his eyes, feeling the rhythm, waiting for the crowd to sing the next line back to him as they always did. "I never got rich, but I don't care." He stepped back from the mic, expecting the roar of 60,000 voices to fill the silence. Instead, he heard confusion. He opened his eyes. The stadium floor, usually a sea of smiling faces and lifted hats, had changed. It looked like a field of fireflies, but the lights were wrong. They weren't the warm yellow of lighters. They were the cold, harsh blue of smartphones. And the people weren't looking at him. They were looking down. They were looking at each other. He saw movement in the front rows, not the rhythmic dancing of fans, but the erratic, jerky motions of prey, sensing a predator. George stopped playing. He didn't make a big show of it. He simply laid his hand across the strings of his guitar, silencing the instrument. The band, sensing his shift, trailed off one by one. The fiddle player lowered his bow, looking at George with a question in his eyes. The drummer caught the cymbal, stopping its vibration. Silence fell over the NRG Stadium, but it wasn't the respectful silence of an audience waiting for the next song. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, pregnant with violence. George stepped up to the microphone, his brow furrowed. He scanned the crowd, his eyes sharp. He had seen bar fights, he had seen weather evacuations, he had seen medical emergencies, but this was different. This was a wave of hysteria moving through the crowd like a physical object. In the VIP section, Brad was ecstatic. His viewer count had hit 50,000. The comments were scrolling so fast he couldn't read them. "Run. He's going to shoot. Why isn't the music stopping?" Brad felt like a god. He had created this. He was controlling the emotions of a stadium. He kept the camera trained on the shadows, even though the old man had disappeared behind a stack of amplifiers. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about the narrative. He whispered again, louder this time, reckless. "I think he's setting up. I think he's getting ready. Everyone needs to run." The word run filtered out from the VIP section. It jumped from person to person. A woman in section 104 screamed. It was a high, piercing sound that cut through the tension like a knife. That scream was the spark. In the upper tiers, people began to scramble over seats. In the general admission area on the floor, the crowd surged backward away from the stage, compressing the people in the back against the barricades. George saw it happening in slow motion. He saw the terror in Sarah Miller's eyes as she clutched her daughter, looking for a way out that didn't exist. He saw the potential for disaster. If 60,000 people decided to run at the same time, the stampede would kill more people than any weapon ever could. The exits were too small. The panic was too big. George felt a cold anger rising in his chest. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he knew fear when he saw it, and he knew that fear was a liar. He unslung his guitar and set it gently on the stand. He walked to the edge of the stage, ignoring the security detail that was now rushing toward him, speaking rapidly into their earpieces, their hands hovering over their holsters. They were confused, too, getting reports of a gunman, a bomb, a terrorist, a dozen conflicting stories generated by the echo chamber of the internet. George waved them off. He stood at the very precipice of the stage, a lone figure in a white cowboy hat against the darkness. He looked out at the sea of terrified faces, illuminated by the ghostly glow of the devices that were holding them hostage. He grabbed the microphone stand, his knuckles white. His voice, when he spoke, was not the singing voice of a country star. It was the voice of a grandfather, a rancher, a man who had pulled calves out of the mud in freezing rain and stared down bulls that weighed a ton. It was a voice of absolute, unshakable authority. "Turn on the lights," George said. The sound engineer hesitated. The show protocol was strict. Mood lighting, spotlights. "I said," George's voice boomed, echoing off the concrete rafters, rattling the bones of every person in the building. "Turn on the house lights, all of them, right now." There was an agonizing second of delay, and then with a massive audible clunk of breakers flipping, the stadium was flooded with blinding white light. The shadows vanished. The mystery evaporated. Suddenly, everyone was exposed. The darkness that fear needs to survive was stripped away. 60,000 people blinked, shielding their eyes, freezing in their tracks. The stampede that had been seconds away from erupting was paused, suspended in the sudden brightness. George didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of the light. He looked directly at the front row, at a young man who was holding his phone up like a shield, his face twisted in terror. "Son," George said, his voice calm, conversational, but amplified to reach the heavens. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Put that phone down and talk to me. What are you seeing on that little screen that I'm not seeing with my own two eyes?" The young man trembled, lowering the phone slightly. He shouted back, his voice cracking, "The live stream, the guy with the gun, he's backstage, he's right there." George frowned. He didn't look back, he didn't flinch. He just looked at the boy. "A guy with a gun?" "Yes, it's all over Twitter, it's live. He's in a trench coat, he has a rifle case." George's expression shifted. A trench coat, a case. A memory flickered in his mind. He looked toward the wings of the stage, past the confused security guards, past the roadies who were crouching behind equipment cases. He looked toward the service entrance, where he had been expecting a visitor for the last 20 minutes. A visitor who was notoriously always late. A visitor who felt the cold in his bones, even when it was 90 degrees outside. George's face softened, the anger replaced by a profound, disappointed sadness. He understood now. He understood the sickness that had infected his show. He looked back at the crowd, and for the first time that night, he looked tired. Not physically tired, but weary of a world that jumped to the worst possible conclusion before taking a breath. He walked back to the center of the stage and pulled the microphone from the stand. He began to walk stage left, toward the VIP section, his boots clicking rhythmically on the floorboards. "You said there's a live stream," George said, his voice dangerously low. "That means someone is filming, right now." He stopped at the edge of the stage, towering over the VIP pit. His eyes scanned the area until they locked onto a young man with bleached hair, holding a phone with a gimbal stabilizer, crouching behind a barricade, but still pointing the lens toward the stage. Brad froze. He saw the King of Country looking directly at him. He saw the massive screen behind the stage project his own face, terrified and small, for 60,000 people to see. "You," George said, pointing a finger that felt like a loaded weapon. "Stand up." Brad didn't move. He couldn't. "I said stand up," George repeated, and this time the command was not a request. "You want to tell these people a story? You want to be famous? Well, congratulations, son, you've got the floor. Security, help him up." Two large guards hoisted Brad to his feet. He looked like a child caught stealing candy, except the candy was the peace of mind of thousands of families. "Bring him up here," George said, "and bring the gunman too. I think it's time we introduced everyone." The crowd held its breath. The tension was no longer fear. It was a desperate need for answers. The air crackled with the electricity of a storm that was about to break, but nobody knew if it would bring rain or fire. George stood center stage, waiting. He was about to gamble everything on a moment of truth, betting that reality could still defeat the lie if it was shown in the harsh light of day. The silence that descended upon NRG Stadium was heavier than the humid Texas air outside. Under the unforgiving glare of the house lights, the 60,000 souls who had gathered for a night of music now looked like deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming semi-truck. The illusion of the concert was shattered. There was no more mystery, no more romance, just the stark industrial reality of concrete, steel, and fear. The vast arena, usually a place of collective joy, felt like a courtroom where a verdict was about to be delivered. But nobody knew who was on trial. George Strait stood at the center of this storm, a solitary figure in a crisp button-down shirt and starched jeans. He didn't pace. He didn't fidget. He stood with the stillness of an old oak tree that had weathered worse storms than this. His guitar was back on its stand, a silent observer. In his hand, the microphone was held loosely, but his grip was firm. He watched as the security team, burly men in yellow windbreakers, who were usually tasked with stopping overzealous fans from rushing the stage, now escorted a young man up the metal stairs. Brad, the architect of this chaos, looked nothing like the confident broadcaster who had been whispering doom into his phone just moments ago. Stripped of his filters and his angles, he looked small. He was 22, but under the gaze of a living legend and 60,000 angry, confused people, he looked 12. His bleached hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and his legs seemed to have forgotten how to work. He stumbled on the top step, nearly falling onto the stage, but a security guard hoisted him up by the arm, not unkindly, but with zero patience. The massive LED screens behind the stage, which usually displayed close-ups of guitar solos or lyrics, now projected Brad's terrified face in high definition. Every pore, every bead of sweat, every twitch of his eye was magnified to 50 feet tall. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a low, dangerous sound. It wasn't a cheer. It was the sound of a mob realizing they had been toyed with. George raised a hand, not to wave but to command silence. The murmur died instantly. He turned slowly to face Brad. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He just looked at him. It was a look of profound, crushing disappointment, the kind a father gives a son who has done something so foolish it defies words. "Give him a microphone," George said quietly to a stagehand. The stagehand, a grizzled roadie with tattoos up his neck, shoved a wireless mic into Brad's trembling hand. Brad clutched it like a lifeline, his knuckles white. He looked out at the ocean of faces, faces that were no longer digital numbers on a screen, but real breathing human beings. He saw a mother wiping tears from her face. He saw a man holding a protective arm around his wife. He saw the fear he had manufactured, and for the first time he felt the weight of it. "What's your name, son?" George asked. His voice was calm, amplified through the massive speaker array, reaching the very top row of the nosebleed section. "B. Brad," the young man stammered. The feedback from the mic shrieked for a second, causing the crowd to flinch. "Brad?" George repeated, testing the name. "And tell me, Brad, what do you do? Are you a reporter? Are you with the police?" Brad swallowed hard. His throat felt like it was filled with sand. "No, sir, I'm a content creator. I do live streams." "A content creator," George said, letting the words hang in the air. "And tonight, You decided to create some fear, is that right? I saw a gun, Brad blurted out, defensive now, his influencer instinct trying to salvage the narrative. He pointed a shaking finger toward the wings of the stage. I saw a man in a trench coat. He had a rifle case. I was just trying to warn people. I was trying to save lives. The crowd rumbled again. The mention of the rifle case reignited the spark of panic. People in the back rows stood up, craning their necks, looking for the exits. The hysteria was still simmering just below the surface, ready to boil over. George didn't flinch. He turned to the security chief, a large man named Mike who had been with him for 20 years. Mike, bring him out. Bring the man Brad here is so afraid of. The tension in the stadium ratcheted up to a breaking point. Every eye turned to the stage left entrance. If Brad was right, if there really was a gunman, then George Strait was inviting death onto the stage. The silence was absolute. You could hear the hum of the amplifiers. From the shadows of the wings, a figure emerged. He was flanked by 2 security guards who looked more confused than threatened. They weren't holding him. They were guiding him, almost gently. The man was old, ancient even. He walked with a shuffle that spoke of 80 years of gravity pressing down on him. He wore a thick, charcoal-grey wool trench coat that looked like it belonged in a noir film from the 1940s, buttoned all the way to the chin, despite the sweltering heat. On his head was a fedora that had lost its shape long ago. He looked frail, lost, and utterly bewildered by the blinding lights and the sea of people. But it was what he carried that made the breath catch in 60,000 throats. In his right hand, gripped with a strength that defied his age, was a black, hard-shell case. It was long. It was narrow. To a generation raised on news reports of tragedies and active shooter drills, it had a terrifyingly familiar silhouette. It looked exactly like a case for a tactical rifle. A woman in the front row screamed. It was a short, sharp sound of pure terror. "He's got a gun!" The panic flared again instantly. People in the first few rows scrambled backward, knocking over chairs. Security guards on the floor drew their tasers. The air was electric with violence. "Hold it!" George's voice cracked like a whip, louder than the fear. He stepped forward, putting his own body between the crowd and the old man. He held up both hands, palms out. "Nobody moves. Nobody touches him." George walked over to the old man, who had stopped in his tracks, trembling, clutching the case to his chest as if it contained the crown jewels. The old man looked up at George, his eyes wide and watery behind thick glasses. He looked terrified, not of the crowd, but of having done something wrong. "George," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible even to those close by. "George, I'm sorry I'm late. The traffic and my hip." George's face softened instantly. The stern mask of the commander vanished, replaced by a look of tender affection. He reached out and placed a hand on the old man's shoulder, steadying him. "It's all right, Mr. Clement," George said, his voice warm and amplified for the world to hear. "You're right on time." George turned back to Brad, who was staring at the old man with a mixture of confusion and lingering suspicion. Then George turned to the crowd. He gestured to the old man. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said, his tone shifting to one of storytelling, the same tone he used when introducing a ballad about lost love. "I want you to meet someone very special to me. This is Mr. Arthur Clement." The crowd was frozen, caught between the visual evidence of the gun case and the calm demeanor of their idol. They didn't know whether to run or listen. "Mr. Clement," George continued, "was the music teacher at Pearsall High School for 45 years. He taught me my first chords. He taught me that music isn't just noise, it's a conversation." George looked down at the old man. "Mr. Clement, that coat is mighty heavy for a Texas summer." The old man blinked, adjusting his glasses. He seemed oblivious to the thousands of people focused only on his former student. "Well, George, you know how the air conditioning gets in these big places. My bones, they don't like the cold anymore. I didn't want to freeze while I waited for you." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the front rows. The humanity of the answer, the simple, relatable frailty of age, began to chip away at the monster the internet had created. George nodded. "And the case, Mr. Clement, that's what has everyone so worried. This young man here," he pointed at Brad. told 60,000 people that you were carrying a weapon. He told them you were here to hurt us." Mr. Clement's eyes went wide. He looked at Brad, then down at the black case in his hand. He looked horrified. "A weapon? Oh, my heavens. No. No. No." He began to fumble with the latches of the case. His hands were shaking, ravaged by arthritis and fear. He struggled with the metal clasps. The sound of the latches clicking open echoed through the silent stadium. Click, click, click. Every heart in the building was beating in sync. Brad leaned forward, his phone still in his hand but forgotten at his side. The security guards tensed. Mr. Clement lifted the lid of the case. Inside, nestled in crushed blue velvet, was not a rifle. It was not a machine gun, it was a violin. It was an exquisite instrument, the wood burnished to a deep, honey-colored glow by a century of handling. It looked fragile and powerful all at once. Alongside it lay a bow, the horsehair taut and ready, and a collective exhale swept through the stadium. It was a physical sound, like a massive tire deflating. The tension broke, shattering into a million pieces of relief and sudden, overwhelming shame. George reached into the case and gently lifted the violin. He held it up to the light, turning it so the varnish caught the glare of the spotlights. "This," George said, his voice thick with emotion, "is a 1928 Roth violin. It belonged to my father. Mr. Clement has been restoring it for me for the last 6 months. He drove 2 hours today in traffic at 85 years old to bring it here so we could play one song together." He lowered the instrument and turned his gaze back to Brad. The young influencer was pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The narrative he had built, the exciting, viral story of danger and heroism, had just collapsed under the weight of the truth. "You see, son," George said, walking slowly toward Brad, the violin still in his hand, "you looked at a man and you didn't see a person. You saw content. You saw a thumbnail for a video. You saw what you wanted to see to get your clicks." Brad took a step back. I didn't know. It looked like a gun case, I swear." "Say it looked like a case," George corrected him. "You filled in the rest. And because you were in such a hurry to be the first one to say it, you didn't stop to ask. You didn't stop to think. You just hit broadcast and terrified families who came here to forget their troubles." George gestured to the crowd, to the thousands of faces now illuminated by the house lights. "Look at them, Brad. Really look at them. That's a mother holding her baby so tight she's leaving bruises. That's a husband who was ready to trample people to get his wife to safety. That's fear, real fear. And you created it out of thin air." Brad looked down at his shoes. Tears were welling up in his eyes now. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving only shame. "I'm sorry," Brad whispered into the mic. "I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize to me," George said sternly. "I'm just a singer. You apologize to Mr. Clement, who you almost got tackled by security. You apologize to every single person in this building whose night you ruined." Brad turned to Mr. Clement. The old man was wiping his glasses with a handkerchief, looking more embarrassed than angry. "I'm sorry, sir," Brad choked out. "I didn't mean to. I thought—" Mr. Clement looked up, squinting. He smiled a gentle, toothless smile. "It's all right, son. Eyes play tricks on us sometimes, especially when we're looking for ghosts." The grace of the old man was a hammer blow to the crowd. It was the ultimate rebuke to the hysteria. George stepped back to the mic stand. He didn't want to destroy the boy, he wanted to teach the room. He sensed the mood of the crowd shifting from fear to anger. They wanted blood. They wanted Brad thrown out, arrested, punished. George knew that mob justice was just the flip side of the panic they had just felt. He had to steer the ship. "Now," George said, his voice commanding the space again, "we have a choice. We can let this night end in anger. We can let this boy's mistake be the thing we remember. Or—" he turned to Mr. Clement and handed him the violin. "Or we can do what we came here to do. Mr. Clement, do you think your fingers are warm enough to play?" Mr. Clement took the violin. He tucked it under his chin, his posture straightening instantly. The frailty seemed to vanish as soon as the wood touched his jaw. He raised the bow, his hand no longer shaking. "I think I can manage, George," the old man said, his voice stronger now. George picked up his acoustic guitar. He looked at the band, nodding. He looked at the lighting director. "Kill the house lights," George ordered. "Give me a spotlight on Mr. Clement, and turn off every single screen in this building. I don't want to see a phone. I don't want to see a live stream. If you're filming this, you're missing it." The stadium plunged into darkness, darker than before. Then a single pure beam of white light cut through the gloom, illuminating the old man in the trench coat. Brad was still standing there, in the dark, forgotten. "Brad," George said from the shadows, "you stay right there. You sit on that speaker case. You put your phone in your pocket, and you watch. You watch with your eyes, not your camera. You learn something about what's real." Brad sat. He put his phone away. For the first time in years, he was just present. George strummed a G chord. It rang out, warm and resolving. "This is a song about leaving," George said into the dark. "But tonight, it's about coming back to the truth." Mr. Clement drew the bow across the strings. The sound that emerged was mournful, sweet, and incredibly human. It wasn't perfect. There was the scratch of age in it, the tremble of a long life. But it was real. It was a sound that no algorithm could generate. As the melody of "The Cowboy Rides Away" began to fill the massive space, the atmosphere in the stadium shifted again. The fear evaporated completely, replaced by a heavy, reverent awe. The connection was back, but it was deeper now. It was a connection forged in the fire of near disaster. George began to sing, his voice lower, more intimate than before. I knew the stakes were high right from the start. He wasn't singing to the fans anymore. He was singing with his teacher. He was singing for the truth. But the night wasn't over. As the song built, George had one more lesson to teach, one that would ensure that when these 60,000 people walked out the doors, they would carry more than just a memory of a song. He needed to seal the pact. The first note of the violin cut through the darkness like a diamond dragging across glass, sharp, clear, and impossibly pure. It was a sound that carried the weight of 85 years of living, a sound that spoke of dust storms in the 30s, of wars fought and ended, of loves found and lost. Mr. Clement stood in the solitary pool of white light, his eyes closed, his chin tucked tight against the dark wood of the instrument. The tremor in his hands had vanished completely, replaced by a muscle memory that went deeper than bone. He wasn't just an old man in a heavy coat anymore. He was a conduit for something divine. George Strait stood a few feet away, strumming the acoustic guitar with a gentle, rolling rhythm that cradled the violin's melody. He watched his old teacher with a look of reverence that silenced the stadium more effectively than any command could have. When George leaned into the microphone to sing the chorus, his voice was tender, stripped of the polished veneer of a superstar. He was singing harmony to the old man's lead, and the last goodbye's the hardest one to say. And this is where the cowboy rides away. The lyrics took on a new, profound meaning in the wake of the panic. The crowd, still recovering from the adrenaline of the false alarm, found themselves weeping. It wasn't the hysterical crying of fear they had experienced minutes ago. It was the cleansing tears of relief and beauty. In the front row, Sarah Miller, who had been clutching her daughter in terror, now swayed slowly, holding the little girl's hand, tears streaming down her face as she watched the gunman play a lullaby for 60,000 people. On the side of the stage, sitting on the black subwoofer case where he had been banished, Brad sat motionless. For the first time in his adult life, his hands were empty. His phone was deep in his pocket. He wasn't framing the shot. He wasn't checking the lighting. He wasn't thinking about a caption. He was just watching. He saw the way the light caught the dust motes dancing around Mr. Clement's fedora. He saw the way George Strait stepped back to let the old man shine. He saw the faces of the people in the crowd, not as metrics, not as a demographic to be exploited, but as human beings who were currently sharing a single fragile moment of grace. Brad felt a lump form in his throat, a hard, painful knot of shame. He realized, with a clarity that hurt, that he had almost destroyed this. He had looked at a man bringing a gift and saw a threat. He had looked at a gathering of joy and saw a headline of tragedy. The music washed over him, and for the first time he understood what George had meant. The screen was a wall, not a window. He had been living behind the wall for so long, he had forgotten what the sun felt like. As the song neared its end, Mr. Clement played a final soaring cadenza. The notes climbed higher and higher, trembling with emotion, before resolving into a low, mournful sustain that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. The last vibration faded into the vastness of the stadium. For 3 seconds there was absolute silence. No one moved. No one breathed. It was a holy silence. Then the explosion happened. It wasn't a bomb. It was applause. It started as a rumble and grew into a roar that shook the concrete foundations of the NRG Stadium. 60,000 people rose to their feet. They weren't cheering for George Strait, the king of country. They were cheering for Mr. Arthur Clement, the high school music teacher from Pearsall. They were cheering for the violin. They were cheering for the truth. Mr. Clement opened his eyes, blinking in the spotlight. He looked startled by the noise. He looked at George, unsure of what to do. George smiled, a genuine wide grin, and gestured to the crowd. "Take a bow, Mr. Clement," George shouted over the roar. "They're all yours." The old man awkwardly bowed, tipping his fedora. The noise got louder. He bowed again, deeper this time, a smile breaking across his weathered face. He looked 10 years younger. George walked over to the microphone as the applause slowly began to subside, settling into a warm, buzzing energy. He signaled for the house lights to be brought up to a dim glow, enough to see the faces, but soft enough to keep the intimacy. "That," George said, his voice thick with emotion, "is what real power looks like. Not fear, not rumors. That right there." He pointed to the violin. "That is the truth." He turned his body toward the side of the stage. The crowd's gaze followed him. They landed on Brad. The young man was still sitting on the speaker, looking small and defeated. The anger in the room flared up again for a moment. A low hiss of booing started in the upper decks. George raised his hand instantly. "No," he said firmly, "we're not doing that. We're not ending this night with hate. That's what started this mess." He walked over to Brad and extended a hand. Brad looked at the hand, then up at George's face. He hesitated, unworthy. "Stand up, son," George said gently. Brad took the hand and stood up. His legs were shaky. He walked with George to the center of the stage. He stood next to Mr. Clement. The tableau was striking: the legendary cowboy, the ancient teacher, and the broken influencer. Past, present, and a confused future. George put an arm around Brad's shoulder. He felt the boy trembling. "Folks," George addressed the crowd, "this young man made a mistake, a big one. He let his imagination run away with him, and he took a lot of you with him. He forgot the first rule of the cowboy code: talk less, say more." He spoke before he knew. George looked at Brad. "But I look at him, and I don't see a villain. I see a boy who got lost in a machine that rewards the loudest voice, not the truest one. He thought he was protecting you, in his own twisted way. He was wrong. But tonight, he learned a lesson that no amount of likes can teach." George turned to Brad. "Brad, look at Mr. Clement. Look at him." Brad turned to the old man. Mr. Clement was holding his violin case now, looking at Brad with soft, watery eyes. "I'm sorry, sir," Brad wept, the tears finally spilling over. "I am so sorry." Mr. Clement reached out a shaking hand and patted Brad on the cheek. "You have good eyes, son," the old man rasped. "You just need to learn what to look for. Next time, look for the music, not the noise." The forgiveness was absolute. It broke the tension in the room completely. The crowd, seeing the old man forgive the boy, let go of their own anger. The booing stopped. A few people clapped, then more. It wasn't a roar of triumph, but a ripple of acceptance. George nodded. It was done. The wound was cleaned. "Security," George said. "Please escort Brad out. Not to the police station, just out. Let him go home. Let him think." 2 guards stepped forward. They were gentle this time. They guided Brad toward the stairs. Before he stepped down, Brad stopped. He turned back to George. He didn't have a microphone, but he mouthed the words, "Thank you." George tipped his hat. "Go on now and keep that phone in your pocket for a while." Brad descended the stairs and disappeared into the tunnel. He didn't pull out his phone to live stream his exit. He walked into the night alone, with a story he would never post, but would never forget. George turned back to Mr. Clement. "Mr. Clement, I think it's past your bedtime and mine too." The crowd laughed, a warm, easy sound. "Let's get you home," George said. He signaled to his stage manager to help Mr. Clement off the stage, with the honor befitting a headliner. As the old man walked off, clutching his violin, the cheers rose one last time, a wave of love sending him on his way. George was left alone on the stage. The band had stepped back into the shadows. It was just him and 60,000 people. The night had been salvaged, but it had changed. It wasn't just a concert anymore. It was a shared survival. He picked up his guitar one last time. He walked to the edge of the stage and sat down on a monitor, his legs dangling over the edge. He looked out at the vast darkness of the arena. "You know," George said, his voice conversational, intimate, "we live in a strange world, a fast world. A world where a lie can travel halfway around the earth before the truth has time to put its boots on. Tonight, we saw that happen. We saw how fragile we are." He strummed a chord, a G major that hung in the air. "But we also saw something else. We saw that when the lights come on, the monsters disappear. We saw that a piece of wood and 4 strings can be louder than a panic. We saw that we are better than the worst things we imagine." He looked up at the upper decks. "I have one last favor to ask you," George said. "Earlier tonight, those little screens in your pockets were used to spread fear. They were used to separate us. I want to change that. I want to see those lights one more time, but not for a live stream, not for a post." He paused. "I want you to turn them on for the person standing next to you. I want you to light up this place so we can see each other, so we can see that we are all here, we are all safe, and we are all together." Slowly the lights began to appear, one by one at first, then in clusters, then in waves. But the feeling was different. The cold, blue, frantic energy was gone. These lights were steady. They were like stars coming out after a storm. Thousands upon thousands of lights filled the darkness, turning the terrifying cavern of the NRG Stadium into a galaxy of white fire. It was breathtaking. The house lights were still dim, so the phone lights created a canopy of brilliance. People looked around, smiling at the beauty of it. They weren't looking at their screens. They were holding them up like candles, using the technology that had almost divided them to create a symbol of unity. George smiled. He looked out at the constellation of fans. "That's better," he said softly. "That's much better." He began to play the opening chords of The Chair. It was a simple song, a song about a conversation, about meeting someone, about human connection. "Well, excuse me, but I think you've got my chair." The crowd sang with him, every word. They sang loud, drowning out the memory of the panic. They sang to prove they were still there. As the song wound down, George stood up. He took his hat off and held it over his heart. He looked at the audience, his eyes shining. "Thank you, Houston," he said. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for seeing the truth. Drive safe, be kind to each other, and God bless Texas." He waved, put his hat back on, and turned to walk away. He didn't run. He walked with the slow, steady gait of a man who knows exactly who he is. The lights of the phone stayed on as he left the stage, a sea of stars guiding him home. The broadcast had ended hours ago, but the connection remained. Outside, the Texas night was hot and still. The digital world continued to spin, full of noise and fury, but inside the stadium, for one brief, shining moment, the only thing that mattered was the music, the truth, and the peace of knowing the difference. The cowboy rode away, but the lesson remained, echoing in the hearts of 60,000 people who would never look at a notification the same way again.